So good afternoon to everyone. We are pleased to have you online for this debate from the Robert Schuman Foundation on the four wars of Vladimir Putin. Much has been said about being 20-year-old this year in the time of COVID. But in Russia, being 20 this year also means having lived through the time of Vladimir Putin only. Putin mainly as a president and also as a prime minister for 4 years. And with the reform of the constitution that was adopted this year, Putin could stay, in theory, could stay in power until 2036. It would then be 84. But we are not there yet. Today's Russia is very much the product of the rule and of the worldview of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, a former KGB officer who thinks that the end of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Political freedoms have remained limited, the justice system is kept under control, and media are used for propaganda. On the world stage, Russia has tried to remain a global player with invasions in its neighborhood, operations in the Middle East and in Africa, and hybrid destabilizing actions in the US and in Europe. If one can see the reasons of Russia's actions, it is more difficult to define Putin's ideology, if there is one, over his 20 years in power, and to identify his long-term goals and strategy for himself and for his country. This work of analysis has been done brilliantly by our guest today, Sergueï MEDVEDEV, in a book that has been translated into 8 languages, including in English under the title The Return of the Russian Leviathan, and in French under the title Les Quatre guerres de Vladimir Poutine. So today we are very pleased and honored to host Mr. Medvedev. You were until recently a professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, but you had to resign from this position. You also worked at different international think tanks and universities in Germany, Finland, and Italy, among others. So thank you very much for being with us from Moscow today. Actually, the book is a long-term work. It is a collection of essays which were first published as a blog notes on the internet over the years. And I should add also that the book, or at least the English translation, won the Pushkin House Book Prize a few weeks ago. It is a prize for the best non-fiction book in English on Russia and on the Russian-speaking world. And it was, I think, the first time it was awarded to an author who lives and works in Russia. So congratulations for that. To discuss with you today, we are also pleased to welcome Galia ACKERMAN. You are associated researcher at the University of Caen in France, a renowned specialist on Russia and the post-Soviet states. You are also a writer and a translator, and indeed, you translated Sergueï MEDVEDEV's book in French. So thank you for being with us. And also, Philippe de Surmain, you are a former ambassador of France, in particular in Ukraine or in Iran. You also co-chaired the Minsk group, which goal was to try to solve the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh. And you are a member of our scientific council here at the Robert Schuman Foundation. Thank you for taking part in our discussion. So I will turn first to our guest, Sergueï MEDVEDEV. I described Vladimir Putin as a former KGB agent, officer, but surely it is not enough to understand who he is and how he sees the world. And actually the 4 wars to which the French title of your book refers are 4 areas that you think orientate Putin's thinking and actions. So can you tell us as a start what these 4 wars, these 4 areas are, and whether they form since the last 20 years, in the last 20 years, whether they form a coherent set that we could call Putinism? The floor is yours, Mr. Medvedev.
Merci. 2 words in French, just let me engage myself. Je suis très heureux de parler à la public française, de présenter mon livre. Et je voudrais parler français. C'est la langue que j'ai étudiée il y a 22 ans à l'université. Mais pendant ces ans, je n'ai parlé si beaucoup en français, mais je peux lire, je peux écouter. C'est une grande joie de parler français dans la situation sociale.
Il est très bien conservé, votre français.
Dans le restaurant. Mais je ne suis si sûr que je peux exprimer dans les matières sérieuses que ce livre et nous allons parler de matières sérieuses. So I apologize for speaking English to the French public. I think my French teacher would be ashamed of me, but hopefully she's not following. Anyway, so thanks for joining in this discussion. And well, you're right. It's the book is about the 4 wars of Putin. How the book was called in French by Galia, and thanks again for the wonderful translation. I think the main thing which happened to Russia in the past 20 years, in the 20 years of Vladimir Putin, is the return of the state, the return of the big state, what I call the return of the Russian Leviathan, if we use this metaphor from Thomas Hobbes. And what was going on is that this big animal which emerged from the sea, if we take the Hobbesian metaphor, was just going on the land and pressing on various spheres of life, private life of citizens, politics, economy, basically nationalizing the Russian economy, intervening in foreign affairs, reinstating the Russian Empire. So what I did, basically, I just took stock of these developments. This is indeed a set of essays which were written in between 2012 and 2018 and published in various outlets like the Russian Forbes, Vedomosti, Republic. There are several more or less liberal Russian outlets which published my essays. And then it sort of came together into 4 big areas in which I think the state and Putin, who is the embodiment of the state, lead their offensive. And this is what I call the war for territory, a war for space, a war for symbols, a war for the body, what Michel Foucault called biopolitics, and a war for the mind, a war for memory, the memory war, which was especially evident in 2020. So this year is like the year of victory. We have a new religion in Russia called Victory Day, and the 9th of May, which is for us the V-Day, the Victory Day, is indeed perpetually celebrated as a big liturgy. So Russia is totally immersed in the memories of the Second World War. And this is also an interesting thing to observe for a historian and for a sociologist. So I was writing these essays with a very split sentiment, because on the one hand, I was deeply concerned as a citizen, as a Russian citizen, to see the liberty in my country being taken away piece by piece. So the liberty which we enjoyed back in the 1990s and still in the early 2000s, it was disappearing, and especially in the past 5 years after the annexation of Crimea, we have seen this evaporate and Russia turning into, I would say, well, not yet a totalitarian, but like a harsh authoritarian state. Like, pretty much like what we see in Belarus these days. I think if things continue this way, this is the future of Russia. And we can, of course, talk about Belarus, but Belarus has been showing examples of what Russia will become in 3, 4, 5 years. So we can see some kind of like in a magic ball, what can happen in Russia in a couple of years, looking at Minsk, looking at Belarus these days, which has been basically turned into a prison nation, a nation of a concentration camp. So on the one hand, this was, of course, deep grief observing this. But on the other hand, this was also a secret pleasure of a historian, because I'm a historian by education. I teach political history of Russia. And it really was for me very rewarding to see how the things which I teach my students, the basic patterns of Russian history, of Russian statehood, are returning in the 21st century. So something which started 500 years ago under Ivan the Terrible in the Muscovy of the 16th century keeps coming back in the 21st century. The same model role of the state, the same role of the ruler, of the society divided into estates dependent on the state. So, I mean, this is all replaying. It's like the last act of the Russian tragedy of the Russian Empire replaying itself in the 21st century. So there was this double schizophrenic sentiment. On the one hand, you know, deep resentment of a Russian citizen, and on the other hand, the secret pleasure of a historian. So, yeah, so this is like a few words about my book.
Yeah, I unmute myself. Thank you. So how would you describe maybe the way the system works between politics with a very centralized way of governing the country and economy, which is also one of the bases of Putin's power with oil and gas, and the interaction between businessmen, the oligarchs, and the country. What is the part of politics into it, and the part of the economics, and how do they interact, and how strong is this basis for the power of Vladimir Putin?
Well, thanks. That's a good question. But what I can say, you know, we really have to think twice when we use things like words like politics and economics with respect to Russia, because I would argue that Russia does not have politics and Russia does not have economy. Politics is a sphere of mediated conflict. We've seen politics like now in the streets of Paris, the streets of France, you know, when people demonstrate, you know, demanding from Macron to revoke the new bill on the, like revealing the identity of the police. And then, you know, it's taken up to the political discussion, and then the law is changed. So this is what is called politics. What we see in Russia is basically one-man rule. And the discussions which are taking place around the body of Vladimir Putin. I mean, I sometimes use in this book this metaphor of two bodies of the king. There's, you know, the famous book by Ernst Kantorovich, King's Two Bodies on the Medieval Political Theology, in which the king, for instance, the French king, represented the political body of the nation. And, you know, the politics was taking place inside the king's body. And this is pretty much the medieval practice which takes place in today's Russia, because politics is what happens in Putin's head and in his, you know, talks with the closest allies, with his encirclement. And everything else is just a simulation, because foreign ministry is a simulation, parliament is a simulation, Ministry of Defense is a simulation. They simply rubber stamped the decision which are made elsewhere. The same is also economics. You see, Russia doesn't really have an economy as such. Russia is one big fat pipeline, exporting oil and gas. And the state is like a big outgrowth on the pipeline. There's a big frog sitting on the pipeline, which is called the Russian state. And what happened in Putin's time is that the pipeline has been basically taken, nationalized by the state. Not really nationalized, but it was privatized by, you know, the ruling class, the ruling elite. And they are now just splitting the spoils of the oil exports. Like you take away, for instance, the oil export now, if you look 50 years in the future, when there is the hopefully world energy revolution, when we turn to green energy, when there'll be electromobiles, when there'll be like wind generated electricity and so on. When Russian oil and gas is no longer needed in the world, I mean, there'll be no such thing as Russian economy, right? Okay, there'll be some survival economy. People will be like what we call this garage economy. People will be doing some barter trade. So there will be some, you know, grassroots trade going on. But apart, if we look at the structure of the Russian exports, if we look at the structure of the Russian economy, it is just one big pipeline. And then the rest of the so-called Russian economy is distributing the rent. And so economy in Russia is really about distribution of the rent, not about exchange, because we know that economy is the market. The market is about exchange. In Russia, there is no such thing as exchange. It's just distribution. The state distributes the rent from the oil exports. So this is a very peculiar model in Russian politics and the Russian economy. And once again, the pivotal role in everything is the state. And the state is Putin, the Kremlin, and his close encirclement.
One of the quite interesting elements of your book is the part on the war on bodies, how Vladimir Putin wants to have control about private lives and the way the people lives, and how sincere is it in Vladimir Putin's mind, this kind of actions, this kind of policies, and how much is it a way of following conservative feelings which are deep under the Russian society, and how is it a way to have a stronger power, or is it a way to try to lead Russia to some kind of alternative model to what is being done outside Russia, or to what was the case in the 90s also, just after the fall of the Soviet Union? And how has it evolved over the 20 last years? Because Putin was not seen as such a conservative when he took power, if we compare to now. So how would you describe this evolution and the way it's used in the way he rules Russia today?
You see, there is a big, once again, methodological problem in your question. So let me first deal with this, because I think Russia today is not something which emerged out of Putin's head. I'm, so to say, a Hegelian. I have a very objective view of history. And I believe that what is happening now in Russia in the 21st century is the objective process of the end of the big cycle of the Russian Empire. It could have happened under somebody else, not necessarily Vladimir Putin. He just happened to be the right man at the right time to preside over the last act of the Russian Empire, which lasted for 500 years. So it's not about just Putin's beliefs. It's about a very conservative society. It's about profound post-imperial ressentiment. This is a country which did not yet come to terms with losing an empire. Russia has not in its mind lost an empire. So, Putin is calling, or rather embodying, the profound complexes of the nation. And he is turning them into some kind of political acts. So one of them is what I call biopolitics, following, Michel Foucault, George Agamben, and, Hart and Negri and the likes. It's, there's big homophobia in Russia. There's a sentiment that the West is really immersed in some kind of a color revolution, and like an average Russian looks with great suspicion at things like, LGBT movement, as Black Lives Matter movement, as, the rights of migrants, tolerance, multiculturalism, all this liberal inflows. And the sentiment among the common Russian, I'm not saying about, several million people sort of, sitting on Russian Facebook and living in big cities, but Russia is a country of like 140 million people. So I would say the majority of those are profoundly uncomfortable with the post-colonial, post-patriarchal world. And they would like to see a traditional family with, a father and, and the mother, and no same-sex marriage, no same-sex families. And this is changing. You see, it's something where, Russia is a latecomer to the modern world. If we look like in the long durée, Russia is something like 50, 60 years late to where the West has been. So Russia today is where the West was like in the 1950s. Okay, and in the 50s, if we look at the United States, at the Great Britain, at France, there's lots of homophobia. There's non-acceptance of non-traditional, non-family values. Turing commits suicide back when I think it was like 1950s. because of the homophobia in England. So, you know, thinking of Russia today, think of the Western society back in the 1950s, before the, you know, the sexual revolution, before the minorities revolution of 1968. So, and Putin is calling to this sentiment, and he's really exporting it to the West as well, because I have encountered this on many occasions. There's a traditional genre of, you know, talk with the taxi driver. You arrive to a place, whatever, anywhere in Europe, and you know, you sort of talk with the taxi driver, talk to the people in the pub. And then, you know, suddenly I detect some sympathy for Putin, acceptance of Putin. He is the right guy, you know, he could show it to the Americans, you know, he's standing up for the right values, for the Christian values, for the white race, and so on. So, I mean, he's calling to this anti-liberal, anti-tolerance fatigue in the West. And he's quite successful in that. So he's exporting our Russian conservatism and patriarchalism under the heading of like traditional values. He's exporting this to the West. And then back home it works, you know, making these jokes, being sexist, being, you know, homophobic. This is more or less an official policy these days. But once again, I mean, this is really a tragic rift with the society, because if we look at the Russian urban society, it's changing. The society itself, like once again, I stress the urban society, like whatever, like 15 million people in Moscow, like another 5-6 million people in big cities all across Russia. They are like the Western one. They are more tolerant, more accepting of all this new body practices. But you know, Putin's policy and the Russian inner conservatism is just driving it in a different direction. So there is like an inner rift between the society and the state policy.
Yeah, which raises the question of how strong is the cohesion of the Russian society between these metropolis, urban, liberal, and the rest of the country, on which Vladimir Putin still seeks some support. How do you see that in the coming years? How coherent this society can be, and what kind of impact can it have on Putin's power?
Well, it's absolutely divided. That's one of the biggest problems, I think, for Russia in the 21st century. Having lost the Soviet man, the Soviet society, we have never discovered anything since then. In the past 30 years after the loss of the Soviet Union, Russia has just decomposed. The society is atomized. Like all sociologists are studying enemy, social atomization. There's very little mutual help, mutual assistance. You know, somebody could be dying on the street and people like are not likely to stand by and help. Okay, people will just stand by and make videos on their smartphones rather than helping. Well, of course, this is changing. Of course, there are like small grassroots initiatives in cities. There's, you know, helping the homeless children, helping the animals, and so on. This is growing as well. But generally speaking, the society is divided, atomized, polarized, and, you know, there's also on such issues of the pandemic, for instance. Now, these days, there are bitter debates, but I think this is also in Europe, like COVID dissidents and sort of COVID alarmists about wearing masks. There are fights on the streets. They could be fights in buses. There were literally some people were assassinated on a bus for demanding others to wear a mask. This which happened in St. Petersburg a few days ago. There's lots of aggression. There's lots of hatred. There's lots of intolerance. And of course, this is also between the city and the village. Moscow is pretty much hated because everyone understands that Moscow is, as I mentioned, the rich frog sitting on the fat pipeline. All money from the pipeline, let's say 90% of the pipeline money stay in Moscow. And the rest of the country is envious, because the split in incomes between Moscow and the rest of the country. between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% is amazing. It's really a third world nation in this respect. I mean, there's nothing like social equality in Russia these days. And of course, there's lots of hatred you know, for instance, we see the protests already for 100 days going on in Khabarovsk, which the Russian authorities cannot quell. And this is largely because not they just want to support their governor, but because they hate Moscow, because they want to stress their identity against the Moscow bureaucrats, against the Moscow elite. So this is very indicative of a nation which is profoundly split and disoriented, I think this is really bad omen for the future of Russia. I don't think that in the current regime any kind of social cohesion and common social platform can be found until Vladimir Putin and his elite are in office.
I see that someone in the audience writes to say that he sees incredible parallelism between the American society with the gap between coastal cities and the states in the center of the US. Before we take questions from the audience later on, I will turn now to Galia ACKERMAN, who, of course, you know Russia very well. You wrote a lot about Russia, but you translated Sergueï MEDVEDEV's book. So I'm sure you had thoughts and questions arising from what you translated. So we would be interested in having your reactions to this text and probably some questions to the author as well. Please.
You know, I fully agree with most of what Sergueï Medvedev wrote. It is amazing, very pleasing for me to find a real liberal and a real Democrat in Russia, because it becomes a more and more rare phenomenon. Now, my question concerns not his book, but what goes beyond his book. For instance, there are many speculations about Putin's departure because of health problems. Personally, I don't believe it is true. I watch a lot of Russian television and he looks, sorry to say so, fine. But the regime seems to be weakening, both on economic and political level. So my question is, what is your scenario for the next few years, Sergei? And do you agree that this is more or less the end of this Putin regime, which is approaching?
You know, we're waiting for the end of the Putin regime for the past 20 years, and we're still there. And I'm afraid we'll be still waiting 10 years from now. There are many writers, I wouldn't call the names, that, you know, that been writing this prose saying, okay, this is the last step. This is последнее дно, as we can say in Russian, the last bottom. We reached the last bottom. And they were writing this 10 years ago, and they're writing it now. No, unfortunately, no, I cannot say this. What I can see is that the regime is amazingly resilient. It's a fortress, and it's just adds concrete. It's just add concrete to the surroundings. It entrenches itself. It has, for the time being, you know, it managed 2020. It managed COVID, despite the huge death toll in the Russian provinces. We'll never know about it, but people are dying and keeping silent. You know, people are not blaming Putin for this. People are not blaming the regime for this. They just keep on dying. That's the Russian way. You don't complain. You die, but you don't complain. That's what people in Russia don't understand. People in the West don't understand. So it has reserves, because Putin is obsessed with financial reserves, and his financial bloc is very strong and professional. They have enough money, for instance, they could go on with without any oil revenues for the next 3 years. They've avoided paying money to the population, as different from the West in 2020. So they managed the financial crisis, they managed the economic slowdown, the downturn. They've managed, you know, the global economic crisis, the fall of the oil prices. So, you know, they're very resistant. And they've introduced absolutely draconian set of laws, repressive laws, by changing the constitution, like the change of the constitution, which indeed I think is a constitutional coup, which happened in Russia in the summer of 2020. So after this, they're just printing and printing and printing new repressive laws. So any kind of a public activity, like the opposition in Russia is non-existent these days. The only oppositioner has been poisoned, and I will, I'll be very surprised if they will let Navalny back into Russia. I think he is now a political immigrant. So I mean, there's no way, there's no opposition in Russia these days. The so-called oppositional parties are just puppies there. People cannot go out on the street. Even a solitary protest picket is now the people are being arrested. So we're just approaching the state of, I don't know, like not of North Korea, not of Turkmenistan, but definitely of Belarus and even some, some darker examples. So no, the regime is very resilient. Oh yes, and the most important thing, this regime is accepted in the West. And that's also a very big Putin achievement. Because people like me, the sort of the liberal minority in Russia, all these years we were hoping that there would be some Western influence on events in Russia, on the Russian regime. But what has happened in the past years is we see that the West is reconciled with Russia was the way it is, with Putin that the way it is. Okay, they say, that's the Russian way. Russia has always been like this, under the Tsars, under the general secretaries, and now we see Russia under Putin. And basically, let's say people like myself, we feel betrayed by the West. Well, I know that the West, there's not much that the West could do, right? There's no Churchill these days, there's no nuclear standoff, and the West is not going to risk war for like changing, for regime change in Russia. I know that's the world situation these days, but we have to accept it as a fact. The kind of hopes that we had on a moderating influence of the outside world on the Russian regime that was there back in the 90s, in the Yeltsin times, it's gone. So Putin can do pretty much what he pleases. They can reintroduce the death penalty, they can start shooting people in the streets, they can turn Russia into Xinjiang, into the Chinese Xinjiang. So yes, the West will be accepting some resolutions in the European Parliament, but that's it. That's about it. Russia cannot even can get away with anything in the UN Security Council, right? So the West is immersed in its own problems with COVID, with problems in the European Union, and so on. So whichever way you look, the regime is stable and resilient, and we have to live with it, and we have to observe it. So that's. There are actually some questions there.
Yes, actually speaking about the West, there is a question from Mr. Yamashita about the economic sanctions on Russia. What are the typical views among Russian citizens toward these sanctions and towards the EU and the US, especially at this time of change of administration in the US? You said the West was not tough enough with Vladimir Putin, but there are sanctions. So what is the situation on that front?
Well, we can also say that one of the results of 2020 sanctions are not working. The sanctions, as we know them, of the post-Crimean sanctions of the past 6 years, they haven't really, struck the regime. Russia replies with so-called counter-sanctions, and it's an important instrument for consolidating the inner regime, saying, oh, look, we're at the state of war with the West. So they retaliate against the Western media in Russia. They retaliate against the Western products in Russia. Any Western influence in Russia is basically banned these days because you're immediately labeled as a foreign agent, as a нежелательная организация, as a non-wanted organization. So, even Western assistance for, AIDS patients, for, other things, it's almost non-existent these days. So the sanction regime has worked against, let's say, the common Russians, but has not at all hit the real beneficiaries. Sergei Kirienko cannot travel to the West. Big loss for him. They're making all these deals inside Russia. They're seeing themselves as part of the besieged fortress, and this only reinforces them in their militaristic worldview. The common Russian views of America and Europe, it's deteriorating, unfortunately. I've been observing the sociology, and of course it was pretty much high in the 90s and the early 2000s. Of course, we remember the times when Putin was trying to make alliance with the West. Immediately following 9/11. So let's say the first couple of years of his rule, they were like really high hopes for a progressive development. But now, following almost 20 years of a Soviet type propaganda, and it's really now this Russian propaganda is very much like this. I lived in the Soviet Union. I remember this pretty well. It reminds the 1970s, Pravda caricatures and periodicals. And so on. So, the problem with Russia is obsessed with America. In the view of common Russian, once again, I'm talking about like a huge majority of the people, not maybe the more advanced minority that often speaks for Russia and, is presented in the media and the social networks. But if we look at the common people, America wants to destroy Russia. That's what they have in their minds. So whichever president is there, his aim is really to, destroy the Russian Empire, show the dominance of the American armed forces, and so on. This is absolutely childish. This is absolutely naive. But this is, believe me, drives also the minds of the ruling class, of the Russian elite. That's the same people that 20 years ago were talking about the opportunity of Russia joining NATO, of alliance with the United States, that were taking credit from the IMF and so on. But these are the same people these days that believe that the sole purpose of the policy of the United States is to harm Russia. Like tell you latest development. There is a new speaker of the White House, Jim Psaki, who has a certain bad renommé in the Russian public, because she was there under Obama, and she was the #1 target of the Russian press during all the Obama years. She was the main hero of the caricatures of the Russian propaganda, of the Russian press. And now she is back at the White House once again. So what is the reaction of the official Russian press? Oh, they did it to harm us. So they appointed the lady just to show Russia its place. It's just absurd. That's the last thing which Biden administration would do these days, is just to appoint somebody in his administration, to harm Russia. But that is what is the majority of the people are thinking in Russia. It's, as I just wrote it like an hour ago on my Facebook, Russia is permanently at war with America, but America is not at war with Russia. So this is the very offensive to think about this for Russia. You're at war with somebody, and somebody doesn't even know about it. So America doesn't even know that Russia is a permanent war. With Europe is somewhat different. With Europe, there's, I would say, and once again, I'm giving a rather grotesque view, but I think I'm trying to summarize what the common Russians think. There's an absolutely absurd feeling of the end of the European project, that Europe is coming apart. Europe has hit a moral low, and we cannot look at Europe as well. Russians, of course, would like to have European cheeses and European wine, and maybe go on a vacation in Italy and France, elsewhere. But as a political pattern, no. They have tolerance, they have gay marriage, that's not something which is fit for Russia, and the whole European project is falling apart. Just look at Brexit. So this is kind of a caricature view, or rather condescending view of Russia. And of course, the official propaganda wants to portray this as Russia is the last big like fortress of the white Christian civilization, which, as I said, espouses, projects the correct values to Europe. So yeah, if you read the official documents, for instance, even of foreign policy elite, like there's Sergueï Karaganov's Council for Foreign and Defense Policy. So I'm just basically quoting it from that. that European project is weak, Europe is falling apart, America is there, it will be always anti-Russian, and we can only make allies with China and build our own independent civilization, which will show a different way to the world. So this is the kind of worldview. So just a long answer to Mr. Yamashita's question, no, I don't think that with the current Kremlin leadership and with the current elite, there's any hope for improvement of relations with the United States or Europe. There will be just damage limitation.
Thank you, thank you. We have a series of questions, but I would like first to turn to Philippe de Surmain, who, as the French diplomat with the knowledge of Russia and the region, surely has some remarks and questions to you, Monsieur de Surmain.
No, my experience of Russia is very old. It was during the Soviet time, but I was very impressed by what you said in your book about the will of self-isolation of Putin. So he cultivated this notion of erasure. So I don't see exactly what does it means, because he looks at the Western countries and especially look at Europe as a danger, but there is a very strong relation which is not maybe so well balanced with China. So where is the place of Russia in this vision of the outside world? And it's even more complicated because Russia is more and more present in different areas in the world, and she's playing sometimes a major role in the crisis in Middle East, and not only in Middle East. So I don't see I see this capacity of nuisance which is played in a very sophisticated way, but I don't see what is the objective and which result he is waiting for this very active diplomacy.
Yeah, exactly. I would agree with Ambassador de Surmain. There's a good English expression which is nuisance value. You see, Russia is playing the same game as the Soviet Union did probably in your times at the late Soviet Union, because Soviet Union was big enough to destroy things and to offer some resistance to the West, but wasn't attractive enough to build a new world, to build alliances, to attract new allies, and so on. So the Soviet Union in the late 1970s and 1980s, its goal was just to disrupt as much as it could in international affairs and in relations with the West. And the same is with today's Russia. I think Putin has realized that Russia, I think they realize quite well Russia's military weakness. It is like a fraction of the military prowess of NATO and the United States, and that of China. There is a question I see there for like relations with China and Russia's rapprochement with China in military terms. What rapprochement you're talking about? I mean, there's a huge Chinese army which is more technologically advanced, which is more motivated, which is more organized than any kind of Russian army. Russia is just a junior partner of China in military terms, as well as in economic and diplomatic terms. So this is the rapprochement with a small squirrel with a wolf, or with a small hare with a bear. So this is Russia's rapprochement with China. I mean, we're not playing on the same level field. So in this sense, Russia's policy these days is basically increasing the rifts, increasing the cracks in liberal globalization, and using this hybrid warfare. We've seen in the last 10 years the big years of GRU, of stay of FSB, of secret like state. GRU is main intelligence department of the Ministry of Defense, and FSB, Federal Security Service. So we see them as instruments of Russian foreign policy, right? We see the Litvinenko affair, we see the Skripal affair, and so on, even recently with the poisoning of Navalny, and so on. So Russia is using this hybrid warfare, interfering in networks, interfering in elections, be it the US elections, be it the German elections, supporting the marginal and anti-systemic forces like the New Right in Germany, Alternative for Germany, like in France, which you know quite well, trying sometimes to stage military coups, as it was in Montenegro some years ago. So you see, there's just this very covert special operations, which Russia is pursuing all over the world, trying to disrupt. I don't see any example where Russia can build anything, any new alliances. What? The Eurasian Union? The union with Belarus these days? What is Russia actually building these days? It is just using it, and it's still very powerful as it can disrupt anything, right? Its disruptive value, it's just, engaged in a war with Syria. What kind of national interest does Russia pursue in Syria? Can anyone tell me? Was there any direct threat to Russian national interest in Syria? No, Russia just intervened there to make this warfare more complicated and to be present on the international scene, and as a sort of a testing ground for Russia's post-imperial sentiment. So in this sense, I see Russia's role in the international arena as pretty much disruptive and creating problems for the West, because once again, the West is seen ideologically as #1 enemy of Russia, despite the objective fact that the West is the only basically resource in which Russia could rely in its possible future modernization. It's a source of money, technologies. It's where the elite keeps its, its children, its families, its property, its yachts, and so on. So this is all in the West. But at the same time, in their minds, Russia is in a perennial war with the West, and now is like the final judgment, or the final episode of this war.
You just mentioned Belarus. If we look at Putin's and Russia's foreign policy in recent months, he doesn't seem to have taken major initiative in Belarus, even if he continues to support Lukashenko. In the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Russia was also quite passive if we compare to Turkey's role in the conflict. What is your explanation of this lack of proactive action, or very visible action, if we compare to what it did in Ukraine, in Georgia in 2008, or even in Syria, as you just mentioned? Is there some trend to be seen there, or is it just some kind of pragmatism on the part of Russia?
It sounds paradox, but Russia exports instability. Russia is interested in instability along its perimeter. So it wants an unstable Lukashenko, which can be operated. So they want to have, of course, they don't want the new Maidan. They don't want to have the new Orange Revolution and the opposition taking over and, leading to a free democratic Belarus. I'm afraid, as much as I personally, so to say, suffer seeing everything that's happening in Belarus, I have many friends there. I have colleagues which have been beaten and imprisoned. But I have to admit, I don't see the way out for Belarus out of this, right? And Putin just sits there and watches Belarus bleeding, and Lukashenko's authority and legitimacy fading. So another several months of such beating in Belarus, and Lukashenko will be totally done, and then Kremlin can easily replace him with a more, so to say, pliable figure that will be more acceptable for the Belarusians, more acceptable for the West, and more loyal to the Kremlin than the permanently, so to say, irredentist Lukashenko, who is permanently pursuing his own secret agendas. So, and the same with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Putin now sees a weakened Armenia, and of course, this was also a sort of punishment for the popular Pashinyan, because this was seen as an anti-Russian, anti-Putin revolution, the popular uprising that led to the election of Nikol Pashinyan. So yeah, in this sense, through instability in South Caucasus, Putin has increased Russia has increased its own presence and influence, the Russian peacekeepers there, and so on. So instability plays into Putin's hands, and the same happens in Europe. The same happens in Syria. The more instability we have in the world, the better it is for Russia, because Russia is selling security. It's selling security sometimes from itself. It's selling security from instability. So the more insecurity in the world, the higher the price for the Russian services. So this is the logic in the post-Soviet area, and this is the logic in the broader Russian foreign policy abroad.
I see at least two questions about Nord Stream and what the US and the EU should do. So we know that the US has been opposed to the project, that there are afterthoughts in Germany as well, but that the project is carrying on. Is this a real leverage on Russia to counter these activities of spreading instability in Europe and around Europe, or is it something that whatever is done with the project will not change Russia's actions in Europe?
No, I don't think there's leverage. No. Frankly, I don't think there is a serious way, any imaginable way under current circumstances to change Russian politics. Apart from some really extreme scenarios, which I don't even want to entertain. No, I mean, this will be, of course, sensible in Russia. This is, of course, opening or closing the Nord Stream will be a big hit for Gazprom. It is cancelled, but I don't think this will change the course of politics in Russia, the Nord Stream. So I think it's also very much a victim to the internal European politics, to the national debate, and so on. But the point is that Russia cannot do it on its own. It needs European technology, it needs European vessels to do it. So to say, active European collaboration is vital in this respect.
Last year, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, proposed a kind of reset of Europe with Russia, and there were some kind of opposition from some EU member states. How did you interpret this move from France, and how realistic is it when we look at Russia today? And what should be, if there is one, the right way of trying to improve relations with Russia? Does it have to be threatened? Does it have to be seen as a friend, as a partner, or what are the options?
Well, that's a very hard question. I don't really have a simple answer to this. On the one hand, as I mentioned, Russia is hopeless. I don't think, frankly speaking, that I don't believe that a rethink of Russian internal policy could be done. That Putin could start a new perestroika, change the elite, suddenly, call a halt to repression, allow more internal freedom, be more cooperative with the West. No, we're past this point. It was possible in the early 2000s. It's not possible any longer. We're past the point of no return, and we only have to limit damage until the, so to say, natural demise of the current Russian elite. Excuse me for this pessimism, but sort of as an analyst, I don't want to give any false hope that that Russia can be somewhat pleased and mitigated, that a new partnership is possible. Looking at the current elite, looking at the foreign ministry, looking at those who advise Russian policy, looking at those who influence the security apparatus, which influences Russian policy. So I think this is basically a policy of damage limitation, and probably some firmness is necessary, because there's if we look back once again, we remember on one more occasion, let me remind you, the late Soviet times. They were the leaders of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan that would somehow deal with the Soviet Union. There was some kind of firmness in the approach back then. But once again, somebody now staying in Russia and advising the West, to impose sanctions, close, entry, exit from the country. I don't know. It's also very difficult for me to be advising this way, sitting inside Russia, outside Moscow these days. So I could only say that I would really try to think of the post-Putin Russia and try to grow to think of the alternative figures, alternative scenarios, and so on. But I wouldn't put big hope on making peace with today's Russia. But also what I think is important is that Europe acts consolidated. Because the Kremlin always plays on the differences within Europe, and they wanted to have a private partnership with Schröder. Macron wanted to have his private partnership. There are always these delusions of individual deals. Let's strike an individual deal with Russia. Let's strike an individual deal with Putin, and somehow this will help the common Western cause. Will help with the common Western policy. Now, this is rubbish. You're dealing with an FSB operative. That's it. His goal is to deceive you. And it's not a normal policy dialogue. So this is the Kremlin, this is Russia using the so-called Western partners to its own benefit. But I don't think that this is about honest desire of partnership.
Well, it won't give comfort to policymakers, but at least it's clear. Thank you. Galia ACKERMAN, Philippe de Surmain, do you have any questions again to Sergueï MEDVEDEV?
Yes, I would like to put some more questions. So, for instance, one question on social life in Russia. Sergei, you write in your book about violence against women and children, about persecution of the LGBT community, about the right for women to take care of their bodies as they like, etc. And this is clearly a very liberal and Occidental point of view. What were the reactions of the Russian public to your publications on these subjects in social networks?
No, actually, there were no big problems because, as I say, Russia is very segmented and fragmented. So it's a little bit like preaching to the choir. I'm writing in Facebook over 10 years. I have like a certain following of the people who are reading my essays, my columns, my Facebook posts, my books, there's several, tens of thousands of people. And they know what to expect, and I'm sort of talking to the same people. Well, occasionally when I make a more, acrimonious pronouncement, I see a team of trolls and bots, because we have this bot factories, many of them in St. Petersburg and Olgina, and they have a command and they are sent into my social networks. And then I see immediately 20 comments of the same kind, all liking each other and saying you talk rubbish and you're the enemy of the people and so on. But I know this is like a 2-3 hour troll attack, and you just ban them on social network and that's it on Facebook or elsewhere. So now I wouldn't say that this raised a big. Oh no! Actually, there was one case when when they wanted to charge me to start the persecution for gay propaganda. So which wasn't at all intended. It was a joke. I was writing an article actually for Forbes. It was a very that's a funny story about this, about the book connected with the book. There's the chapter there called "The Protocols of the Elders of Sodom." So there's usually the protocols of the elders of Sion, but this is the protocols of the elders of Sodom. And then I was writing that it's an interesting statistic that cities which have a higher gay and general tolerance index are much more advanced in the new economy. Right, talk of course, San Francisco, talk of Hamburg, talk of London. So many hubs of the new economy also have a high tolerance index. And then I said as a joke in the end, okay, we built this Skolkovo high-tech hub outside of Moscow. So in order to be successful, let's have a gay quarter in Skolkovo. And this was just after accepting the law on gay propaganda in Russia. And there was a move to start a criminal persecution against me because I sort of, it was a joke. Well, but no, it didn't. It didn't pass. So luckily for me, they didn't start the persecution. But this tells you the kind of a situation in Russia in which, when you write something, when you say something, you have to measure every word of yours against the possible criminal persecution, because there's such a pressure on the freedom of speech that you know that any word of yours, any like on Facebook, any repost in Facebook of Contacte, can lead, it can start a criminal affair, you can end up in jail for simply reposting something. So this is very interesting, but also very, very troublesome times to live in.
May I ask a short, more personal question? We always consider that this higher school of economics was the last liberal institution in Russia. But lately there were some limitations of freedom for students, as we all know. And I think that maybe one of the consequences of this policy of the High School of Economics is also that you were more or less forced to resign. May I ask you what happened?
You know what, I mean, it's not an easy question for me because I wouldn't like to go into great detail of what had happened. It's like, I think there was a gentleman's agreement between me and the school, and let me put it, but also I think in a moral sense, it's like you divorce, right? And then you're asked to comment on your ex-wife. So usually I would decline to do this. So in the same way, I would decline to comment. I would just can say that this was not the decision of the High School of Economics. And all this, and another thing I can say that, Russia changed a lot, and it especially changed after 2020. I don't think it's quite understood in the West in all this, haze of the pandemic, but it's a very different Russia after the obnulение, this nullification and the change of the constitution. It's Russia now where everything is possible. As we see with the poisoning of Navalny, I see the question about Navalny from Detlef Pool, and hello Detlef. But this is the country where anything goes now. There are no rules, there are no red lines anymore. And this is probably not what everyone has realized yet. So yeah, my departure from the HSE was like part of a much, much bigger script. And I'm not at all surprised. And let's say this was done in a rather gentlemanly way, this whole thing. And I don't blame the High School of Economics for this, because I know the very difficult conditions in which it operates. But generally speaking, I would say in today's Russia, there's no place where you can safely preach liberal values and speak your mind and stay free. There's simply no way. It's like sometimes and compare it, it's Germany after 1933. There was a policy of Gleichschaltung. So there is the same policy of Gleichschaltung in today's Russia, and unfortunately, it's moving. It's in this direction. There's no stopping this, right? It's like the country is sliding towards a very slippery slide. And there is no way you can stop in this movement. No West can stop it. No civil society can stop it. I'm serious. I'm only looking at the long term, and I'm hoping on the world energy revolution. So the sooner the world will switch to clean energy, the sooner Russia will change.
Philippe de Surmain.
Yes, in your book, there you pay a specific attention to Ukraine. And I wanted you to elaborate more on this, because you show that maybe to remember what said Brzezinski, without Ukraine, Russia cannot be an empire. I'm not sure that it was Brzezinski who said that, but it's a specific problem for Russia. So what could you elaborate a little bit more on this?
Yeah, I can say, but also, yeah, what also there is, there is a comment in which, people complain that I speak too much. Looks like a monologue from me. So sorry about this. I'm being asked questions. So, but of course, I would like also to hear Ambassador Serman and Galia about this. But Ukraine, I mean, you're right on Brzezinski. Brzezinski has once said that Russian imperialism ends and finishes in Ukraine. So that's where Russian Empire ends. Without Ukraine, Russia is no longer an empire. And therefore, there's so much hysteria in Russia about the loss of Ukraine. Therefore, the Crimea, therefore Donbass, therefore the ongoing warfare and the hysteria in the Russian media. For 6 years already, Ukraine is #1 topic on the Russian TV. Russian TV viewers are probably more informed about political life in Ukraine than they are about Russia. It's just, like the media life has moved on to Ukraine. So it's just total obsession with Ukraine. And I can only ascribe this to this post-imperial ressentiment, the fact that Russia has lost finally Ukraine. And this was actually a death blow to Russian imperialism. But Russia has not yet understood it and not yet has reconciled with this. So this is, I think, the problem with Ukraine. But in the end, I think this is a positive development for Ukraine and for Russia in the end too. Because the more independent Ukraine becomes, the more European it becomes, the more stable it becomes, the more eventually the better it's for Ukrainians themselves and eventually for Russians. Because we can only build relations as two totally independent nations in a broader European context. And what Putin did actually in the 6 years is he really has reinforced Ukrainian independence greatly. I think I put it in the book a couple of times that as a joke, I have very sort of dark jokes in this book, that Ukrainians should put monuments to Putin in Ukraine, like they do to Bandera, to whatever, to the other Getmans and so on, because by his actions, he has brought a sense of national unity. This is a nation at war, and there's a clear enemy for Ukraine, which is Russia, which is unbelievable. I mean, I can't believe it. Told me like 10 years ago, told me, in my Soviet childhood that, the prime enemy for Russia would be Ukraine, that will be at war with Ukraine. But that's what happened. And that was just the working of the Russian elite. Ukraine didn't start this war. Ukraine didn't want this war. It was just Russian imperial ressentiment going to this war. And so that's what happened. And I think the next generations of Ukrainians will be like totally independent from the post-Soviet heritage.
Thank you. Among the questions, we have a few about the relations between Russia and Turkey, which is another country with the post-imperial nostalgia and who wants to play a role, which is part of NATO. So what is the game between Russia, Turkey, if we look at Azerbaijan and Armenia, if we look at NATO, at the Eastern Mediterranean situation with Cyprus and Syria as well? Can you explain more about this aspect of Russian foreign policy?
Well, they're like the two, so to say, strong men, two people with strong views, strong policies, and a big authoritarian inclination, just playing on the same in the same sandpit, which is Putin and Erdogan. So we have seen now a very situational alliance now in terms of the South Caucasus. But I think it is temporary, and Erdogan's project of recreating the sort of the Ottoman heritage, the big Turkic empire, will inevitably run against Russia's interests sooner or later. Because there is a big Turkish influence, for instance, in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia. There's a big Turkish influence in the Muslim republics in Central Russia, and so on. So this is some kind of a cultural diplomacy which could be quite disruptive. But yeah, Erdogan is a loose cannon. Inside NATO, he is very independent, he is very authoritarian. That's probably one of the most dangerous leaders with which NATO was dealing in its entire history, in terms of his unpredictability and the kind of problems he could draw NATO into under Article 5. Really, I see there's a battle of ambitions between them two, and I don't see a long-term peace between Russia and Turkey.
We are approaching the end of this very interesting discussions. I will take a question which was sent by email by Mr. Pons, who's maybe online. He read your book, and he left with the feeling of resignation from the Russian people, accepting the lies, accepting the having lost faith in the future. Do you share this feeling about the Russian people today, and what kind of way forward do you see for the Russian people? And I would add that listening to you, I feel a lack of optimism. Like if Putin was really on his way to stay until 2036. So what kind of scenarios could you envisage for the future, for his power, and for how would end Putin's rule on Russia, and in which medium or long?
Living in Russia, you learn to live without planning. That's really a very interesting sentiment, because I lived in the West for a long period, and I relocated back to Russia more than 15 years ago. And I sort of have a Western perspective, I have a Russian perspective. And so in my Russian life, the more and more I feel insecure about my future. I don't know what will happen in 1 month, let alone 6 months. We absolutely don't know. We all depend on one person. You know, Putin can stay, Putin can leave. The institutions don't matter. They can start a new war. They may not start a new war. So it's really a time of, but not only in politics, but also in many walks of life, in you know, in supplies, in what happens with the coronavirus, what happens with the Russian vaccine, because there is so much hype about it, but nobody really believes in it because it was so much pressed by the state. You know, people don't believe in the effectiveness of this vaccine. How will Russia deal with the next wave of the coronavirus? So even with this wave, will the health system cope? So these are all big question marks. What happens to property? What happens to property rights? What happens with the rule of the siloviki, of the repressive organs? So in Russia, you don't plan even 6 months ahead. So you live basically day by day. And for a modern country in the 21st century, that's really an absolutely strange feeling. But look, I mean, I'm not really pessimistic. Somehow I don't find myself in the state of pessimism. It's still a big, diverse country with great people. I wouldn't be living in Russia if I believed otherwise. I have had any opportunity to leave Russia, but I'm still staying here. And I believe in the people of Russia. I believe in in the natural wit and the humor, because humor is the biggest Russian attribute which helped us live through any different era. I've seen civil society gather around many themes like ecology, like animals, like defense of their living space, like defending the small park against building a new church instead of a park, which is a common Russian subject, and so on. And I look at the protesters in Khabarovsk. Okay, they're not supported by the rest of the country, but I'm really amazed at the resilience of the people that go out for 100 days. And then look at the other protests and Shias in Arkhangelsk region, where they wanted to make, the biggest dumping site in Russia, taking all the garbage from central Russia, from Moscow to this remote northern region, right? And people protested there for almost 2 years from all over the north. They stayed there, they had the ecological watch there, they opposed the police, and they got their way. So this is a very different people from, let's say, the Soviet people of the 1970s and the 1980s. The people have become, more mature. I mean, that's also true, which I said about Russia, about the patriarchalism and, the sense of, superiority over Europe and, the perennial war with the West. But, Russia is a very multi-layered story. There are many different layers, many different sentiments happening at the same time in Russia. So my only hope is Russian unpredictability, and that the change in Russia always comes absolutely unexpected, be it in 1917, or be it in, oh, my dog came in, be it in 1917, or be it in 1991. As you know, there's a famous quote. Oh, come on, come here. There's a famous quote from Rozanov: "Русь слиняла в 3 дня." Даже. I'm sorry. Well, this is the hope for the future. This is Bruno. This is
maybe
Bruno.
It's a sign we have to close off.
Yeah. It's time for
Galia ACKERMAN, Philippe de Sirman.
Yeah, like the Russian revolutions, they happened very unexpected and very soon, and absolutely unawaited by the outside world. So this is, let's say, my only hope for the future of the country.
Galia ACKERMAN, do you have a last remark?
I just want to thank Sergueï MEDVEDEV for this very clear explanation of what goes on in Russia. I personally am a little bit optimistic, because I still believe that in spite of what he said about this big fortress, the economic situation is not very bright, let's say. The political situation is not very bright. I mean, there are many things which let me think about 1986, the year of Chernobyl, when suddenly the faith of the Soviet people in the Soviet power collapsed, or started to collapse. And then there was a drastic fall of prices for energy, oil and gas. And finally we got perestroika and the fall of the Soviet Empire. So maybe if Sergei wants to say something, or is it just my dream and my hope that it will happen this way again?
No, I'll just join in and support you in this, and I would maybe also Ambassador de Sirman would like to add something. I think I have said enough in the past hour and a half.
Philippe de Sirman, yeah, please.
I think it was a very interesting expose, and I just advise all those who took part in this meeting to read this book, which is excellent. And by the way, the translation is perfect. So it needs to be read, and I hope that in any case we shall find some hope in the future, because as you said, Russia is an unexpected country, but where the miracles are possible.
Thank you very much. How do we say спасибо, хорошо? Am I right?
Большое спасибо.
Большое спасибо.
Спасибо.
Apologies to all this.
Спасибо вам большое.
I saw a question about the recording. So yes, we are recording this discussion. If all goes well technically, it will be online on the Fondation Schumann website before the end of this week. So you can check our website in French or in English. We will put the recording. Thank you again to the three of you. Thank you again, Mr. Medvedev, and keep on the good work. It's very, very interesting for us in Western Europe. Thank you very much, and goodbye to all. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye,
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.